Good afternoon, everybody. It is week 3. It's kind of crazy to think that we are already on week 3, right? Well, this entire week is going to be dedicated to poetic structure and sounds. So you should have read last week chapters 2 and 3 of the Christos book. Chapter 2, which dealt mostly with how readers work and how writers work, and chapter 3 dealing with literary criticism and literary approaches. So my lecture today will talk mostly about those chapters. We'll talk about the Christos poem a bit, and I'm going to assign the poem and poet essay. Right now I'm just sitting on the page for week 3, but we'll go back to week 2 for a second. Okay. Now, I really enjoyed your discussion board posts on like dealing with chapters 2 and 3 and the Christos poem. I thought they were very insightful and very well thought, so nice work on those. The first thing that I do want to talk about a little post an assignment, well, not an assignment, but an announcement that explains how I do my grading. If my computer loads and we can get to the course home, I will show you. Okay, so it shows right here that um, mostly, actually, I sent that as an email if I remember correctly. Basically, what I do is I will download your poems and then leave comments on them and then reattach them. You can find your comments on your poems in the Dropbox. If you click on Dropbox and then go under the feedback column and view the attachments or the comments, you'll be able to see what I left there. So I hope that you check that out. Going back to, let's see. So I wanted to talk a little bit about chapters 2 and 3 of the core book, first and foremost. I had people asking a lot of really good questions, and I will address some of those questions, but I created a PowerPoint that you can look at for this. If you would, but I wanted to create this little PowerPoint discussing keys to analyzing poems because it's really hard to at least get a firm footing on where to begin our conversations. And the first thing that I want to do, though, is kind of establish a little bit of vocabulary, and this vocabulary is established in these chapters as well. So the first word, ambiguity, which usually represents a group of words or lines that have more than one meaning. Metaphor is a direct comparison of two concrete objects in which one object takes on the characteristic of the other. Metaphor is a little bit more difficult. Simile is very similar to metaphor, except it uses the words like or as in order to make that connection. So I give you an example down here of a metaphor. Daryl's angry reaction. Bolded is because okay, and they are being compared to one another. So that is the basis of a metaphor, and I noticed that many of you noted some metaphors in the Christos poem for today. So that's good. And then last but not least, persona, that is the speaker or the characters in the poem. All right. Now, moving on to the next slide here. Usually, in order to begin a conversation about the poem, you want to start with simple questions. All right. And I think CORE lays out some pretty basic questions that are quite effective. So, the first question that you want to consider is, well, what happens intellectually, emotionally, and psychologically to the speaker or main character during the poem? Okay. Now, I don't want you to get caught up necessarily in the literary um, theories that we will be talking about, that CORE also talked about, because sometimes you have to start out with focusing on the speaker in order to kind of pan out a little bit and understand what's happening in the rest of the poem. Number 2, is there a central object or metaphor in the poem that seems important to the overall meaning or your interpretation? Okay, a lot of poets will have images or metaphors that will pop up frequently, or they may have one that pops up, but the entire poem circulates around that one metaphor. So what is its significance? Like, what do you think the writer is trying to achieve in using that type of imagery? And last but not least, how does the poem end and why does it end this way? A lot of poets will end poems on very peculiar notes. Many of them will end them on very like interesting or poignant notes that will leave additional questions. So why do you think the writer wants to leave the reader that way when ending a poem? This slide I also have the literary criticisms listed. Now, if you took a literature class or maybe a Comp 2 class, possibly even Comp 1, I'm not sure, you may have gone over some of these forms of literary criticism. And the unfortunate thing about literary criticism is it can be quite intimidating. But I'm like my goal here is to try to simplify it for you. And I think Core also does a good job of simplifying the different types of literary criticism. So I want to use an analogy here and help you understand literary criticism by comparing looking at a poem and you want to use one of these different types of literary criticism and apply it. All right. So if I decide to look at, say, psychoanalytic theory and I want to apply it to the Christos poem, I will use psychology as a means to understand what's happening in the poem. I may use Freud's psychological models in order to understand more effectively the message being conveyed. Okay? If I decide to focus on feminist theory, I may examine how gender may apply to the conversation taking place in the poem. Okay. If I decide to focus on something, say, phenomenology, okay, I may decide to think of the writing as being some sort of intentional act directed by the author, and I may use that to help me understand what the writer's vision is. So using those different kind of schools of thought helps us to look at a poem from a particular perspective. So think of the questions that I showed you earlier as kind of the like kind of tiptoeing into the poem, like kind of dipping your feet into the pool. When you look at the literary criticism, that is kind of diving into the pool and taking a swim. All right. And we'll be having more conversations about these different forms of literary criticism. So make sure that you are aware of what each of them mean, okay? Because that will probably be very helpful for you. Now, I wanted to discuss a few of the questions that were asked about the core reading, and one interesting one that John asks was, "How do you avoid running too far into the reading critically and analyzing poetry um, areas without straying too far from the main point the poem is trying to convey?" So my philosophy as a poetry teacher is a right or wrong, but you can kind of get a little too hot or a little too cold when it comes to talking about a poem. And I try to tell people if you can make a solid argument about your interpretation of the poem and your audience can understand it solidly, then I think that's a fair interpretation. And I noticed that a lot of people in their questions were very concerned about, well, what if I get my interpretation wrong? What if I pay attention to the wrong things in the poem, like Simone asked in her post? I don't want you to worry or fret too much about being right or wrong. I want to know your interpretation and I want to understand your thought process. Okay. Now the reason why I'm saying this is because I remember when I was in school a long time ago, told that I was, right or wrong in my interpretations of poems, especially like, and when you're told that you're wrong, that can be very intimidating, especially when it's in front of other people. So I don't discourage people from stating their opinions or stating their interpretations. If I find that your interpretation is broad and unspecific, I may ask you some supplemental questions that will allow you to explain your interpretation of a poem more effectively, okay? Um, so I don't necessarily think there is a right or wrong way, like I was mentioning, but it is possible, like John suggested, that it's possible to stray a little too far. And the truth is, in order to avoid straying too far, you need to be able to ask yourself relevant questions. And I think by staying within those questions that core provides, it'll be easier to prevent ourselves from straying too far. Megan asks, is there a right or a wrong way to look at a poem? And I would say, no, there is not a right or a wrong way. Okay, so that's kind of just building off from the conversation that I had a little bit ago. Um, as long as you can explain it effectively enough, you're good. As long as you can explain your interpretation effectively enough, you're good. Aubrey asks, "How do we trust our judgment when analyzing poems?" And I think that's a very good question. Well, and I think a lot of it, if you guys watched my prior lecture video, I talked about kind of building yourselves into the mentality of acknowledging that we are all poets and that we are all researchers here. All right. In identifying that way, I want that to empower you to feel as though you have the authority to make judgment calls and interpretations on poems, okay? If you feel that you may get something wrong once in a while, don't let that concern you. Just use that as a learning experience. I know, like, there were situations where, say, I decided to apply the psychoanalytic theory to a particular poem, and after I applied it, I kind of realized, well, it's not really the right theory to apply because it kind of doesn't help me understand anything else about the poem. It kind of detracts from what the author intends. If you find that a particular analysis does that, then switch to a different one, all right? Or maybe ask yourself a more specific question. But all in all, I think that was a very good question to ask all of you. But I think you guys are on the right track. From my perspective, you are definitely understanding the ropes of understanding how to analyze different poems. Now, I don't want you to get caught up in your own worries and insecurities because I know in the past you probably have been told, well, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. But in this class, I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong. I am going to ask you to elaborate, to be a little bit more specific, okay? Because we are all professionals here and we are all scholars here. Our job is to understand what these writers are trying to convey and why it's so significant, okay? So, going back to e-learning, um, so I hope all of that makes sense. Okay. So the next thing that you were supposed to do for uh, by last night is read the Christos poem. So I'm going to pull that up really quick. Based on your guys' discussion posts, I found that you really enjoyed this poem, and I'm glad that you did. It's one of my favorite poems. Um, you probably noticed a lot of the different metaphors happening here. For example, comparing stretched tendons to anger and saying that there are women locked in my joints, like that. Like, all of these are very powerful images, and I think that most of you captured effectively what this poem is about. This poem essentially is about resistance and how anger can be used as a crutch for resistance, okay? And you'll notice that Christos here referenced multiple different points in history. It even went as far as suggesting that kind of the erasure of Native Americans is an infection that has gone on for 300 years or more, okay? So, based on your guys' discussion board posts, I can say that your analysis of the poem was very solid, and I'm very impressed with your guys' analytical ability. I will be leaving you more in-depth comments on your interpretation when I grade those discussion posts. All right. Make sure that you also take a moment and read them out loud because you may learn a lot about reading it out loud to yourself. Okay. Now, the last thing that I want to do today, really quick, is introduce I can exit out of that if my computer loads. Um, I'm going to go over the poem and poet essay really quick. So this is going to be the only large structured essay that we do in the class. Everything else is going to be poems or discussion board posts, okay? So this is worth 50 points, and I believe it's due at the end of week 4, if I remember correctly, but I would check the syllabus. I know it says down here June 3rd, all right? So the context for this assignment is sometimes to better understand a poem, one must first do some research about the poet who writes the poem, okay? So you'll notice that this kind of follows the phenomenology theory because it asks you to look at how the poem is kind of an extension of the poet. So in doing so, it may add to our themes or main point when connecting it to the author's interests. So the assignment is, well, first I want you to research a poem and a poet. Then write a 2 to 3 page essay about the poem and the poet. In the essay, you'll want to provide a biography of the poet, a summary of the poem that you chose that was written by the poet, and make a connection. Does the message in the poem help us understand anything additional about the author? So there are 3 things that I want you to cover. Now, organizationally, this isn't a composition class, so I won't be too picky about the essay's organization, unless it is like super duper chaotic. But like most essays, though, you should have an introduction, you should have body paragraphs, and you should have some sort of conclusion. And um, if you want to label your essay in subheadings, I do have an example of that on the second page of this prompt for you to look at, all right, on your own time. So format and citation style, since this is an English class, your citation style should conform to the MLA rules and guidelines. You will be citing poems and web pages. As a quick refresher, I have down here what in-text citations should look like. So if you are citing like lines in a poem, the number in your citation is going to need to be the lines of the poem. So say you decided to reference an Edgar Allan Poe poem, you would have Poe lines 42 through 43 in the parentheses at the end of the quote. All right. Now, web pages, you would reference the author's last name and the page number. If it is a web page that doesn't have a page number, then you would default to paragraph number. Now, right down below, I have a link that will show you how you can do some. Now, obviously, I do expect you to have a works cited page for this essay, and it's probably maybe one poem or maybe like a web page, or you may have 2 sources at most, I would say. And if you have questions about citing sources, please don't hesitate to send me an email. And of course, formatting wise, make sure that your essay is 12-point font, Times New Roman, and double spaced. When it comes to finding sources for poets and poems, I have the Poetry Foundation and poets.org listed. Those are good. Those are 2 good starting places for you to begin looking for um, a poet and a poem. So I hope that makes sense. So to give you a few reminders, if I can get back to e-learning right here, by the end of this, you have core book read, and your sensory detail poem is also due by Monday. Make sure you go back to last week because it does overview the prompt for the sensory detail poem, and well, in the video, and the prompt is listed right here for you to reference. So please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your week. Bye.